This Georgia Department of Education screencast is intended to provide teachers of 5th grade social studies with content knowledge to aid in the teaching of the Georgia Standards of Excellence. In terms of specifics, the standards we will be covering in this screencast are few but relatively complex. We will first look at how the Reagan presidential administration discovered and exploited the growing chink in the communistic armor of the Soviet Union, leading to its complete collapse and dissolution of its member nations. We will then turn our attention to a day that is still very fresh and painful for many Americans, the day the New York skyline was altered in a tragic instant, the day terrorists forced us to instantly ground every single commercial and private plane in our skies for fear they would become missiles that could attack any target within our borders at will, and at great cost to human lives, September 11, 2001. For anyone who lived during the Cold War years, it would be very difficult to ever envision a day when our communist nemesis, the Soviet Union, or USSR, which stands for United Soviet Socialist Republic, would ever fall. And yet, from an economist's standpoint, it should be no surprise at all. The Soviet Union collapsed for many of the very same reasons we so strongly objected to communism and worked throughout the Cold War years to try to prevent its spread. Now, if you have watched the screencast for the Cold War standards, this next bit will seem a bit familiar, but it is necessary to understand what communism is in order to be able to look at why it failed so completely. Communism is, at least in the form it took in the Soviet Union, detrimental to a strong economy. In its purest sense, communism is the idea that everything is shared fairly, that the government owns everything and divides it up equally, thereby protecting us from our own greed. The problem is that governments can become corrupt and greedy too, and in a communistic system, the people have no way to prevent the government from abusing their power and distributing wealth unfairly. With capitalism, on the other hand, private individuals own nearly everything, and greed and pricing is controlled by the free market. Competition from other individuals and the freedom for people to choose to buy or not ensures that prices remain low and quality remains high. And herein lies perhaps the biggest problem with communism and why it eventually has failed in most nations that practiced it. There is no incentive to innovate. Why work hard to invent or develop a concept if you stand to gain nothing by it? Innovation requires time, hard work, and money up front, but the reward is the profits you will reap if successful. Once those profits are taken away and distributed to people who did not work as hard, it becomes difficult to justify innovating, and so the economy stagnates and dies, and so eventually does true communism. And this is essentially what happened in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's time as a communistic empire was actually quite short, in fact. The USSR was formed towards the end of World War I, when the Russian Tsar was overthrown by revolutionaries unhappy with the many hardships the war inflicted on their country, coupled with the rampant corruption of its government. But because communism relies on a strong and theoretically benevolent central government to own everything and distribute it fairly, it is quite easy for that new government to become just as corrupt, and that is precisely what happened. And then there is the problem of the lack of incentive to work, as discussed above. This can be quite neatly summed up by a common Russian joke that says, "They pretend to pay us, and we pretend to work." Or in the words of the Russian economist Grigory Yavlinsky, the Soviet system is not working because the workers are not working. President Ronald Reagan and his administration recognized the economic quagmire the Soviets were in and used this as an opportunity to shift from a policy of simply containing communism to actively trying to dismantle it. One of the first things Reagan did, knowing that the Soviets had not made any real technological advancements, was to upgrade and modernize our armed forces, thereby helping to mitigate the military threat from the Soviets, while at the same time forcing them to try to compete beyond what their stagnated economy could bear. He also initiated negotiations to limit the constant buildup of weapons in both nations known as the nuclear arms race. With an outdated military, a gutted economy, and a dissatisfied and increasingly rebellious populace, the various nations that had more or less been forced into the Soviet Union sought for and achieved their independence, and so you have the collapse of the Soviet Union. There are some dates in history that mark events that were so fraught with powerful emotions that nearly anyone who lived at that time could tell you exactly what they were doing when they heard about what had happened. September 11, 2001 was one such day for most Americans. It was on that day that 19 al-Qaeda terrorists, turned 4 of our own passenger jets into weapons of destruction. Al-Qaeda, founded by Osama bin Laden, was made up of militant Islamists from a number of Middle Eastern countries that were angry with what they perceived as America's interference in their affairs, beginning with the creation of Israel out of Palestine at the end of World War II, to our defense of Kuwait after Saddam Hussein of Iran invaded that country, initiating the Persian Gulf War. The terrorists chose the Twin Trade Towers, a financial center they felt symbolized American greed, the Pentagon, the heart of American military intelligence operations, and the White House, or possibly the Capitol building, as both targets had been discussed and it is unclear which was finally chosen, as that plane crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. In either case, the idea was to strike at the heart of our government. The plan was for the terrorists, who had trained to be pilots, to hijack American airliners headed for California shortly after takeoff, while they were still heavily loaded with combustible fuel, and simply fly them full speed into their targets. Tragically, this plan proved to be even more successful than they had believed possible. The first plane crashed into the North Tower of the Twin Trade Towers at 8:45 a.m. and burst into a searing ball of fire, devastating multiple floors and trapping people in the floors above. A few minutes after 9 a.m., while Americans were still reeling and trying to figure out what had happened, the second plane slammed into the South Tower, shattering any possibility that it had just been a tragic accident. At 9:45, the third jet plowed into the west side of the Pentagon. As America and most of the world watched in horror on live TV, the South Tower collapsed, killing everyone above the crash site and all of the emergency responders, firefighters, and police that had gone into the building to rescue survivors. Half an hour later, to our dumbfounded disbelief, the North Tower came crashing down. The steel and concrete constructed building simply couldn't stand up to the intense heat of the fireball caused by the 20,000 gallons of fuel load the aircrafts were carrying. As the structure supporting the upper floors melted and gave way, they collapsed onto those below, and like a line of dominoes, the increasing weight of each collapsing floor took the whole building down. The fourth and final plane never reached its intended target due to the heroic actions of the passengers and crew who had discovered through cell phone contact with loved ones that the hijacked plane would not be spared and would instead be used to hit some other target. They determined to try to retake the plane, or at least spare people on the ground. We will never know exactly what happened, or who was at the controls when the plane rolled over and crashed full speed into a field in Pennsylvania, killing everyone on board. But we do know that there would have been significant casualties on the ground had the passengers not taken action. The field has since become a national memorial park to honor the ultimate sacrifice of the passengers and crew of Flight 93. Nearly 3,000 people lost their lives that September morning, and the national scars this first truly large-scale terror attack committed on our soil will never really fade. The impact of September 11th was far-reaching and is still evolving. At a minimum, it shook up our sense of security and destroyed our belief that such a thing could not happen here. In the first few months following the attack, when fears were running very high, many bills were rushed through legislation to help address our new sense of vulnerability and make us feel secure again. But many have since begun to question where we draw the line between safety and personal liberty. The attack certainly had an impact on our relationship with the Middle Eastern nations from which these terrorists came, and led to a number of U.S. and Allied actions in that region, collectively named the War on Terror by then-President George W. Bush. It also initiated U.S. retaliation against the Taliban, the religious extremist group that was harboring Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan, and by extension, the U.S. war in Afghanistan. Despite our efforts, bin Laden would not be found until May of 2011, when a team of Navy SEALs found him hiding in Pakistan. We will no doubt be dealing with the repercussions of September 11th for many years to come. And unfortunately, on that very somber note, we are out of time for today. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Here are some links to some helpful resources, as well as those used in the making of this screencast.